Hi guys, welcome back to another tutorial video in the Unity series. Today we're going to be taking a look at UI systems and how that can be implemented within our game. And as an extension from last week, it's going to be focusing predominantly on how we can implement a health system for the target, as well as looking at how we can provide a user interface in the traditional sense in the form of a HUD. Now a HUD, if you don't know, is a heads-up display, and it's one that's going to be always in the user's view, and it's going to consist of things like the player's health, the amount of ammo that the player currently has, as well as displaying messages to the user upon interaction with other elements within our game. For the purpose of this video, we are going to be covering the ammo system only in terms of the HUD. However, the same techniques can be applied to previously stated elements in the future, one of which is going to be the player health system. However, we can't implement that until we've dealt with enemy attack scripts, which is going to be in next week's session. Now, we can obviously see here I'm using a different game. And the reason why I'm doing this is just to show you that all the techniques you've learned so far can be applied to many different game genres. Now, this is going to help you, of course, in terms of the assessment because it's likely going to include a different genre completely than what you're used to. And you're also going to have to deal with the specification, so there's going to be certain outcomes that you have to meet. And in order to do that, you're going to have to break down the logic applied within these scripts so you can replicate it in different scenarios. Now, it's really important that you try to understand the code within this video, as with previous videos, and instead of just mimicking them, you try to understand how you can apply it within your own context. Now, the first thing to cover is where we can find these user interface elements. The first being the Game Object tab at the top of the Unity interface under UI. We can see there a list of all the user interface elements we can include. And the second being right-clicking inside the hierarchy and selecting UI, where we can see the same list. Now, the main ones we're going to be using in this video are going to be text, slider, and canvas. Now, the canvas is going to be the first one to discuss because it's going to allow us a platform in which to add additional UI elements in the future. However, it's also the one that allows us to distinguish between the two types of UI systems that we want to include. The first one, of course, being the HUD style system, which uses screen space overlay, and the second system, which is where the element will have an X, Y, and Z coordinate, which is going to be the world space overlay. Now you can see I've already got a canvas within my scene view, and you can see there within my hierarchy. So go ahead and include a canvas now. Now the first thing we're going to be dealing with is the HUD style system, so the ammo system. Now the canvas for this needs to be set to a render mode of screen space overlay. So again, that's going to be taking the form of a 2D window, which is going to be visible to the user at all times within the camera view. Now to select this option, just left click canvas, go to the inspector, and make sure the render mode underneath canvas is set to screen space overlay. Now this should be set to screen space by default. However, if it isn't, just open the drop down menu and change that to screen space. Now you can see an array of different attributes within the inspector as well, one of which is the canvas scaler and more predominantly the UI scale mode. Now at the moment it should be set to constant pixel size, which means it's never going to change size. However, you can drop that down and also select a scale with screen size option. Now that of course will make the image in this sense on top of my canvas scale with different resolutions. So we're not going to be covering that until we look at how we can accommodate different mobile devices and certainly different resolutions for larger size monitors. So for now, just ensure that the UI scale mode is set to constant pixel size and we're good to go. Now, after you've included your canvas and set those attributes, go ahead and double click the canvas so you can see it inside your scene view. If it doesn't represent itself as a 2D platform, just go ahead and change the camera angle. And one thing to note, of course, is there is a front side and a back side. This, of course, is now set to front side, but just double check underneath your camera angles here, just to double check which side you're on. It will matter, of course, because as soon as you start adding different UI elements into the scene view here underneath the canvas, it may represent itself in a different area within your game view. Now, the next thing to include, which is going to allow us to have a greater degree of flexibility in terms of visuals, is going to be the panel. Now the panel allows us to choose different sizes, different shapes, different colors, as well as the use of different images to customize our HUD system. So go ahead and include a panel as a child object of the canvas, and you can see when you include that it will take up the full size of the canvas by default. Now that's not going to work obviously because inside our game view here you can see it's taking up the full size of the screen, so it's going to overlay on top of all our other game elements. So what we're going to want to do is change the size of this and change the position of it. Because we're dealing with an ammo system, it's likely going to be either bottom left or bottom right. That's typically where most games use their HUD systems. So select either side, left or right, and just go ahead and choose the adjusting tool up in the top left hand side of Unity, and go ahead and resize that panel. So you can see there, even though I'm on the right hand side within my scene view here, it's currently showing on the bottom left. So I'm going to change that round, and I'm just going to move it over to the right hand side. There we go. Now once you've included your panel, you can see in the right hand side of the inspector that we have a number of attributes again. Now the first one to note would be the anchor point. Now if we don't anchor a panel to whichever side that you've decided to include your panel on, when we click play, so if I click maximize on play and click play for my game now, you can see that the size will change. So it'll try to take up the full portion of the screen. So it's currently scaling. So it's not anchored or pivoted to the bottom right. Therefore, it's always going to try to push itself out. So we're going to want to change the anchor point for this panel as well. Now, we depend upon which side will depend upon which anchor point you choose, of course. But in order to adjust this, we can simply click this this box underneath Rect Transform, and we can set the anchor preset. Now you can see here we've got Shift, which also sets the pivot, and Alt, which also sets the position. So what we want to do is remain in a constant position with a constant pivot, so it remains in the same location irrespective of rotation. So go ahead and hold Shift and Alt on your keyboard and select the either bottom left or bottom right, depending on which one you chose. So mine's bottom right. Click bottom right. You can see there within your scene view, if you hold on to Shift and Alt still, you can see the pivot and the position has been anchored to this point here. Now looking further down the right hand side of the inspector, you can see here we've got more customization options underneath image script. The first of which being source image, which will allow you to set the default sprite for the background. Now this is what's going to allow you greater flexibility and control over how the user interface looks. So perhaps you want to go ahead and create your own default PNG or to make it a nice and snazzy user interface. Perhaps make it look all sci-fi or futuristic or something that fits in with your scene. You can do so there. Now your color, of course, is going to change the color of the background of the panel. So I'm going to change mine to be a darkish purple to fit with the scene. Your material will, of course, add a material to it. Raycast targets we'll be dealing with in a future session when we're dealing with raycasts. And image type, of course, is either going to change it to slice, which is a default, which is just going to be a rectangular space in which color fill will fill out the whole area, or we've got tiled, filled, or simple. Just keep it as slice for now, and of course we've got there fill center as well, a checkbox, so you can deselect that if you want to, or keep it filled. Now the panel, of course, is now in the right location, and we're going to start to add some other elements to this so we can start to represent some text. Now the text, of course, is going to be controlled through scripts. However, at the moment, we're just going to add some text in there to show where it's going to be represented within our game view. Now underneath the panel, so you're going to want to make this this text a child object of the panel this time to keep it all in one location. You want to go ahead and click UI again and just include text, which is a top option. Now you can see there it'll automatically apply a similar box as what the panel did, so we can go ahead and adjust that to whatever size we want. So I'm going to adjust it to the same size as the panel. And on the right hand side in the inspector, again, you've got the anchor point. So I'm going to anchor it to the center. So hold Shift, Alt and center. And underneath the inspector tab again, underneath the text script, you can see text. So we can change that to maybe ammo. because we're dealing with ammo. And you can also set the font size, font style, whether or not there's any line spacing, and whether or not it's rich text as well. So you want to go ahead and change and adjust these to how you see fit. I'm going to change my font size to Open Sans Bold, and I'm just going to increase the font size perhaps to 16. And further down, you can obviously see there's also a color option as well. So I'm going to change the color just to make it a little bit more visible. And we've also got alignment. So I'm going to align mine center and down a bit. Perfect. Now, it's usually a good idea at this point to go back into our hierarchy and start to adjust some of the naming conventions for our panels and text systems. It's likely because we're going to include more text in the future, we're going to want to distinguish between each one so we can drag them into our code in the inspector view so we can reference them a little easier. So I've changed mine to ammo text, and I've changed my panel to ammo panel. Now, once you're happy with how it looks, we're going to go ahead and start to script this text option. Now, obviously, we want the ammo to represent how much ammo the player currently has, but we also want it to update every single time that the user clicks the left mouse button. Now, the left mouse button check is obviously going to be inside your bullet spawn script. For mine, it's going to be in the shoot script, but I'm going to take you through some of the requirements or the prerequisites to allow us to interface with this UI system first. So go ahead and open up your left mouse button check script. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my shoot script. And the first thing we're going to want to include, every time we want to reference a UI system within a script, we're going to want to include the library for the UI. So right at the top of your script, you're going to have to include a new using tag, and we're going to include Unity Engine .ui and end that line off with a semicolon. So that will allow us to use all the syntax within the Unity engine in regards to UI elements. Now, the next thing to note, of course, is we want to make sure we can actually update this text. So we're going to want to create a new public variable so we can reference this ammo text field. So back into Visual Studio, we're going to go under our public class, and we're going to create a new public variable of type text. So this will allow us to interject new text within that field once we've dragged it into the inspector. And all I'm going to do here is call that ammo text, and that line with a semicolon. Now we also need to know exactly how much ammo we currently have. So we're going to create a new public variable of type float, and we're going to call this ammo. Now by default you can make this equal to something, so in my case I'm going to make it equal to 100F, simply because of the fact my weapon shoots probably a lot faster than yours does. You can adjust the ammo to whichever you see fit. I would suggest using a smaller size just so when you go back into your game and test it out later on, it goes down fairly quickly. But of course, with it being a public variable, you can do that with the inspector. Now the next thing we're going to want to do is set the default value for this ammo text field. So whatever's going to be displayed in that text field when the game starts. So we're going to do this in the void start method, and we're going to say ammo text dot text, because we want to interject a string value into that text field, is equal to speech marks ammo with a colon and a space, just to give a bit of space in between the ammo text value and the actual ammo value. And we're going to plus the ammo variable we created. So that's going to display the text ammo plus the text for the amount of ammo we currently have. Now if we click save and head back into Unity, we can see there if we left click the object the script is attached to, we now have a public variable ammo text. So we want to drag and drop our ammo text text field over into the inspector. And once you've done that, you can go ahead and click play. And you should be able to see on the bottom right now that you have an ammo equal to the amount of ammo that you set. Now, if you didn't set the ammo value inside the code, you obviously make sure you go ahead and set the ammo value inside your inspector. Now, when we left click, it doesn't do anything. Okay, so we're going to have to go back into the code and -1 every single time that the left mouse button is clicked. So go ahead into your void update, see where your if statement is to check for the mouse input, and every time we left click, we want to -1 off the value. So we're going to go ahead and go ammo minus equals 1. Now just to check that works, go back into Unity, click play, and you can see in the inspector, it's not going to display on here, which I'll explain in a second. It will -1 off the ammo variable on the right. So every time I left click, it goes down by 1. But of course, the text field isn't updating because we are not calling the ammo text.text in the update method. It's always in the start method. So after the ammo minus equal 1, we're going to have to update this text field. So we're going to say ammo text.text again is equal to ammo with a little space there plus ammo. So that's going to update the ammo variable every time we shoot now. Click save, head back into Unity and click play. Now what you'll notice now, of course, is every time I left click, it reduces by 1. However, a new issue has arisen. Every time I left click, it's going to go into negative numbers. So obviously we don't want that to happen. Instead, what we want to happen, we want the user to stop firing when it reaches less than 1. So if we've still got 1 bullet left, they're allowed to shoot. If it's less than 1, we don't want them to shoot. So we're going to have to do that in an if statement because we want to check for that value. But in order to do that, we're going to have to wrap it around the if statement for checking the mouse button. Because what we don't want to happen is for the user to be able to left click the mouse button irrespective of how much ammo they have. So we're going to want to check for the ammo, and if the ammo is greater than 1, we're going to check for the input. So you're going to have to wrap this input with a new if statement, and we're going to say if ammo is greater than or equal to 1, curly brackets, and wrap the last curly bracket around that if statement, so it looks a little bit like this. Then if it is greater than 1, we will allow the input. So that should work straight away. We're going to click save, head back into Unity, give it a second to update, and click play. And you can see now when I go down to 0, it won't let me go any further. Okay, now you can extend that and add a new message to the user if you wish. Of course, if they get down to 0, you may allow them to reload. They might have a certain number of magazines, for example. So to do that, go back into Visual Studio. And what we're going to do instead is we're going to add an else statement to this if statement. So if the ammo is not greater than 1, so if it's less than 1, then we're going to display a new text value inside the ammo text variable. Now we don't need to do else if less than 1, because the else, the opposite of greater than equal to 1, is always going to be less than 1. So we can just say else. So if we open that up with squiggly brackets and say ammo text.text is equal to perhaps reload, end that with a semicolon. Then if we save that and head back into Unity now, and give that a second to update again, and click play, you can see there when I get to 0, it'll ask me to reload. Great. Now, once you're happy with that, maybe go back and readjust the background color, readjust the text position, perhaps maybe try to include a different background image, maybe one that you want to create in Photoshop. Give it a bit of a try, and we're going to move on into WorldSpace UI. Now, a WorldSpace UI element takes a position within an X, Y, and Z coordinate in WorldSpace. As stated previously, we're going to want to include a target health system, so something that's going to track the amount of health that your enemy model has. Last week, you should have been able to implement an enemy controller script to control that health, so every time a bullet impacts with your enemy, it reduces the health by a certain value. So we want a UI element to display that to the user to improve the amount of feedback that they're getting. So you're going to want to go ahead and double click your enemy model. So you can see that within the scene view. And we're going to want to go ahead and create a canvas, so a new canvas this time as a child object of the enemy. Now this canvas is, you're going to want to change the render mode of this canvas to world space instead. So instead of screen space overlay, change that to world space and double click the canvas. Now you can see that the world space overlay will take an origin position of your enemy model. Now, of course, this is relatively large. It's going to be too large to display above the enemy's head. So you're going to want to adjust the width and the height of the canvas as well. So I'm going to change mine to a width of around 3 and a height of around 1. And you also want to go ahead and just adjust the position of it. So reset its position so it goes directly above the enemy model. Now, if you double click the enemy model, you can see there the canvas is now surrounding the model. So you're going to want to go ahead and move that up just above the enemy. Left click on the canvas and move that up. Now, instead of creating a panel this time, we're going to include a slider instead. Now, a slider allows us to set a minimum and a maximum value. So we can use that within our code to represent the enemy's health, because every time the enemy's health reduces, we can set the slider value to equal that health. So underneath your canvas, you want to go ahead and right click and you want to go to UI and create a new slider. Now the slider, when you include it, will be relatively large. So you want to go ahead and select your scale tool at the top left, and you want to scale the slider down all the way so it fits inside your canvas. So go ahead, scale that down to around there. Now you'll notice on side the slider, if you expand it within inside your hierarchy, we have the actual slider itself, and within the slider we have a script. So if you look inside the inspector, you can see there we have a minimum value and a maximum value, as well as its current value, which is a slider value. So you can see when we increase that, the slider value in this instance goes down. So we need to rotate that round the y-axis. So I'm going to rotate that by 180 degrees. So you can see that as the value increases, the slider goes up, and when it goes down, the slider will go down to the left-hand side. Now the issue with this, of course, is we've got this handle attached to it as well, which isn't going to display correctly when we're either reducing the enemy's health or increasing it, etc. So we're going to want to remove that slider handle. So if you go to the handle slide area underneath the slider in the hierarchy, and we're just going to remove that handle. So just go ahead and delete the handle. Now another issue here, of course, is the slider itself will only get to a certain point now because we've removed that handle slider. So you can see there, if we left click the slider and increase the value to its utmost value, so 1, you can see it doesn't actually go all the way now. So we need to adjust that fill area to actually go all the way to the right. Now, while we're here, we can also adjust the background. So the background object here is referencing the background behind the slider tab. So we can go ahead and change the color of that, and it's likely going to be red. And the fill area of the actual slider itself is going to be green. So whenever the value is high, the green is going to go all the way to the right hand side of the slider, and whenever it's low, it's going to display the background, which is going to be red. So that's going to indicate to the user how much health the enemy has lost. Now, if you left click the fill area, you can see there, if you zoom in, that the left hand side, or rather the right hand side, sorry, of the fill area is stopping around there. So we need to make sure it goes all the way to the end. So snap it to the far right hand side of the overall slider, and the same with the left hand side as well. So just snap that to the left hand corner of the slider container. Now obviously the fill value goes farther than the slider area in total. So we need to left click the fill, and we just need to reduce the fill and snap it back in. Now what you'll see when you do this, when you go back to the slider and reduce or increase the value now, it should just stop when it gets to the left, and it will stop when it gets to the right as well. Now this is ready to go now and script. We're going to be wanting to script this panel actually within our enemy. Obviously, the enemy controller script is going to be the one that's controlling the health. So we're going to want to include the same libraries within the enemy controller script as we did in the previous script. And we're also going to be wanting to set the maximum value as well as the current value of the slider. And we're going to want to reduce the slider amount every time the enemy takes damage. So go ahead and open up your enemy controller script into Visual Studio. And you're going to want to include the using Unity Engine.ui library. And we're going to want to create a new public variable again. Now the public variable this time is not going to be referencing text, but instead it's going to be referencing a slider. So public slider, and we're going to call this maybe enemy health slider. And we're also going to be wanting to set a health value. So you should have done that already with the enemy controller script from last week. But this health value is going to equal the enemy health slider value. Okay, so in your private void start, so in your void start method, we're going to want to make the enemy health slider dot max value equal to the enemy's health value. So I've just called my public float health. And we're also going to want to set the enemy's health slider's current value, so dot value equal to the health as well. So that means the maximum value of the health slider cannot exceed the health value that you've defined for your enemy, and the current health value of the slider will always equal the health when the game starts. Now the next thing to do is reduce the enemy's health slider value by the amount of damage it takes. Now the amount of damage it takes is controlled by the take damage method, in which it will take a damage amount from our shoot script or our bullet move script, and it will reduce the health by the variable float. Now in the public take damage, we also want to, when we reduce the health minus equal amount, we want to make the health slider, or rather the enemy health slider, dot value equal to health. So what that will do, every time the health minus equals amount, it will update the enemy health slider dot value to the current health. Now if we pop back into Unity and left click on our enemy, we're going to have to drag and drop our slider into the public variable enemy health slider. And when we click play, go ahead and shoot the enemy. And you should be able to see that health slider value reducing. Now, as an extension to this session today, guys, what I'd like you to do is go away with what you've learned and try to implement at least 2 different types of user interface elements. One of which, of course, should be the world space UI, the second being the screen space overlay. So just to give you a bit of advice, it might be, for example, that your player may want to interact with another object in the scene. So for example, if you walk up to a barrel which you've already included, you may want to show a world space UI to display the text barrel. Or you may want, for example, to enter a trigger event or a trigger zone in front of a house model that you've included, and you may want to show a screen space overlay to say press E to enter the house. Entirely up to you. Work out the logic. You're going to have to obviously implement some more scripts. You're going to have to be checking for perhaps distance between an object and your player. Otherwise, if you're pressing the E key or another interactivity key, you're going to end up interacting with that on the other side of the game field. So think about it, plan it out, and try to implement it. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next session where we'll be covering NavMesh agents and AI mechanics, so we can start to get a little bit more interaction between our enemy model and our player. And we'll be tracking all those interactions with extended UI.